Hello, I am Ann Hargraves, co-chair of the Summer Lecture Series Committee for OSHER at Dartmouth. COVID-19 caused us to cancel our planned 2020 series, so we thought you might enjoy replays of 6 of the most memorable lectures from previous years. Each lecture will run about an hour. Some, notably the debates on voting rights on July 23rd and affirmative action on August 6th, will have updates from the original speakers. I am excited to bring you today a lecture from 2017 series which addressed global challenges confronting the United States. The title of today's lecture is Nuclear Proliferation, and the speaker is Bill Perry, former U.S. Secretary of Defense, whose career spanned academia, industry, entrepreneurship, government, and diplomacy. He served as the 19th Secretary of Defense for the United States from February 1994 to January 1997. In 2007, Perry, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and Henry Kissinger together formed the Nuclear Security Project, articulating practical steps to reduce nuclear dangers. Perry founded the William J. Perry Project in 2013 to engage and educate the public on the dangers of nuclear weapons. In 2015, he published My Journey to the Nuclear Brink, a personal account of his lifelong effort to reduce nuclear danger. Let's listen now to his lecture.
And good morning to all of you. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Each sequestered in its hate. The poet W.H. Auden wrote those prophetic lines in 1939 on the eve of World War II. In the next 6 years, that nightmare led to the death of more than 50 million people. When World War II ended in 1945 with the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world wanted to believe that that nightmare was over. But within 5 years, the Cold War had started, and now the nuclear bombs that had ended World War II posed a new kind of nightmare. A nuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union could have led in an hour to more deaths than World War II produced in 6 years. Indeed, a nuclear war threatened no less than the end of civilization. Leaders of our two nations at the time understood that and developed a strategy which they called Mutual Assured Deterrence, aptly nicknamed MAD, to try to prevent this catastrophe. MAD did work, but it was incredibly dangerous, and more than once nearly led to a catastrophe. In particular, we came very close to a nuclear holocaust during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Have we forgotten the Cuban Missile Crisis? For some in this room, it may be easy to forget it because it happened after you were born, or pardon me, before you were born. But I will never forget it. I was there during that crisis as part of a small team that worked all day analyzing the intelligence collected that day. By midnight, we had prepared a report for President Kennedy on his desk first thing in the morning. So I knew exactly what was going on. Indeed, every morning when I went into our analysis center, I believed would be my last day on Earth. After the crisis, President Kennedy said that he believed that we had a 1 in 3 chance of going into a nuclear holocaust. 1 in 3, not very good odds. I believe that Kennedy's assessment was optimistic. He did not know, which we now know, that the Soviet Union had already deployed tactical nuclear weapons, which were fully operational, and which the commanders had the authority to use. If Kennedy had accepted the recommendation, and indeed the unanimous recommendation of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, and invaded Cuba, our troops would have been decimated on the beachhead by tactical nuclear weapons, and without doubt, a general nuclear war would have followed. The miscalculations of Soviet and American leaders at that time almost subjected our countries to a nuclear holocaust. And I believe that we avoided that holocaust as much by good luck as by good management. And the Holocaust, had it occurred, would have destroyed not only the United States and the Soviet Union, it would have wreaked terrible damage on countries all over the world, China, India, Japan, Korea, countries that were spectators in the Cold War. In the nuclear war, there is no place to hide. Indeed, considering the long-lasting effects of radiation, as well as the atmospheric disruption of the sun's rays, it is doubtful that our civilization would have survived. Today, because of the ongoing hostility between the United States and Russia, we are recreating the conditions that could lead to a nuclear war, lead us to blunder into a nuclear war. Beyond the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were at least 5 false alarms during the Cold War that might have resulted in an accidental nuclear war. Because of our launch-on warning policy, an accidental war could result in a missile attack, could result if our missile attack system experienced a false alarm. So how likely is that? During the Cold War, there were 3 such false alarms that I know about in the United States, and at least 2 in the Soviet Union. That averages out to be about 1 every 8 years. I personally experienced one of those false alarms, and it changed forever my way of thinking about nuclear dangers. It occurred in October of 1979, when I was the Under Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. I was awoken by a phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. And as I picked up the phone, still not quite awake, the voice on the other end identified himself as the general who was in charge that night of the American Air Defense Command. The general got right to the point. He told me that his computers were showing 200 missiles on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. And for one horrifying moment, I thought we were about to experience the nuclear holocaust that we had narrowly avoided during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the general quickly explained that he had already concluded it was a false alarm. Why was he calling me? I was the research person in the Pentagon at the time. He was calling me because he wanted to figure out what the hell had gone wrong with his computers. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know what. Well, there's a sequel to that story. I could not, that night, based on what he told me, determine what had gone wrong with his computers. It took us 3 days to get to the bottom of it. It was very simple. When the watch changed that night, the new computer operator coming in, instead of putting in the operating tape in the computer, mistakenly put in a training tape. And so what we got is a very, very realistic simulation of an attack underway. That happened in 1979, and I will never forget that night. So the question then arises is, could that happen again? And if it did, would we be smart enough to figure out what had happened? It was human error. That is, our system, with all of its safety features, was still vulnerable to a single person erring, potentially bringing about the end of civilization. Two things saved the world from that fate. First, the watch officer that night was exceptionally thoughtful and responsible. Had he not been, we would not be sitting here today. And second, the context for the attack was benign. That is, there were no international incidents underway that made a Soviet attack plausible at that particular time. But what if that false alarm had occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or during one of the Mideast crises we had, where we had our systems on high alert? In that context is important. In that context, the watch officer surely would have felt obliged to pass the message on to the president. The president then, instead of myself, would have been awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning. He would have had about, if he was lucky, 10 minutes to decide whether to launch our own ICBMs, without context, hardly without a chance to consult with anybody. 10 minutes. And had he ordered the launch, there would have been no way of recalling the missiles or destroying them in flight. But the president would have started a global nuclear war by accident. Well, humans will err again. Machines will malfunction again. So we will have more false alarms. Even in the face of this, today, both Russia and the United States still have a policy of launch on warning. And both Russia and the United States are building new ICBMs to replace the ones we built during the Cold War. That means ultimately, much will depend on the judgment of the watch officer in the United States or in Russia, and the temperament of the Russian president or the American president. So today, just as in the Cold War, we face the possibility of an accidental war destroying our civilization. Let me say again, I believe we survived the Cold War as much by good luck as by good management, and today we are still depending on that good luck. When the Cold War ended in 1989, the world breathed a huge sigh of relief. We had somehow dodged the bullet, a bullet that could have extinguished our civilization. And for a decade or two, that seemed to be true. But in the last decade, inexplicably to me, we are beginning a new Cold War. Let me sum up my whole talk then with my next sentence. I believe that today, the likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe is greater than it was during the Cold War, greater than it was during the Cold War. And yet we here in this room today are blissfully unaware of that. And therefore our policies do not reflect that danger. In my talk, I'm going to explain why I believe that, why the dogs of Europe are barking again, and not just in Europe. I will visit those nations where the barking dogs conceivably could escalate into a nuclear nightmare: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan, with special emphasis on Russia because they have the largest nuclear arsenal. Before I talk about Russia, let me qualify it. I am, in fact, a Russophile. I've visited Russia more than 30 times. I've led 4 Stanford study tours to Russia. I love Russian music, Russian literature, Russian art. I have many Russian friends, some for more than 3 decades. But I must tell you, I am today very concerned about what is going on in Russia. U.S. and Russian relations today are comparable to what they were in the Cold War. How could we have let that happen? Have we forgotten already the existential dangers of the Cold War? During the 90s, after the Soviet Union dissolved, there was a very dangerous time in Russia for Russians. The possibility of a major disorder, even a civil war. I give great credit to the Russian people who got through that crisis without major bloodshed. But they did end in a period of economic collapse and gross abuses, for example, the privatizing of the state-owned property. The economic collapse entailed heartbreaking hardships for tens of millions of Russians, especially those on pensions. I and others argued unsuccessfully of course, that we should assist Russia's transformation with something like a Marshall Plan. But of course that never occurred. But when I became Secretary of Defense in the 90s, I was in a position to foster positive relations with Russia, particularly with the Russian military. So I worked to bring Russia into the Western security circle instead of standing outside it throwing rocks into it. We brought the Russian Minister of Defense into NATO meetings. I formed the Partnership for Peace of former Warsaw Pact nations working with NATO nations to participate in joint peacekeeping operations. We organized a joint military operation in Bosnia, and in that joint military operation, a Russian brigade, a crack Russian brigade, was assigned to an American division commander working in NATO. We actually had a Russian brigade as a part of a NATO operation. That took some high-order diplomacy, and I have a few pictures to try to illustrate what happened at that time. So if you'll excuse me, I'll see if we can turn this on. This is a picture of the American Secretary of Defense, myself, shaking hands with the Russian Minister of Defense after we agreed that he would have his brigade work in NATO. And the card here, I don't know whether you can read it, that we're holding up, says Russia plus NATO equals success. You can hardly imagine that today. And this is a picture of the Russian brigade commander and myself. I went over about halfway through the Bosnia operation to pin a medal, an American medal, on the Russian brigade commander because he was one of the exemplary performance in Bosnia. That was one thing we did jointly with the Russians. We also jointly dismantled 4,000 nuclear weapons in the former Soviet Union. At the same time, by the way, I was also dismantling about 4,000 in the United States. We jointly agreed to honor Ukrainian borders. Here is a picture that had to do with the dismantling of nuclear weapons operation. This was at a place called Pervomaisk, which is the largest and most modern of the Russian ICBM installations. At that site alone, there were more than 1,000 nuclear weapons targeted at the United States. And we dismantled all of them, and this is a picture of the silo after we blew it up. And this last picture I want to show you, after we blew up the silo, this is the Russian Minister of Defense, the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, and the American Secretary of Defense in a three-way handshake, congratulating ourselves on this good job of dismantling the nuclear weapons. That period undoubtedly was a high point in U.S. and Russian relations. But when I left the Pentagon in 1997, I fully believed that we were well on our way to ending forever the Cold War enmity. But that was not to be. In the late 90s, we began a downward slide. NATO expanded to Russian borders, in my opinion, prematurely. Indeed, I strongly argued with the President against doing it. In the next decade, the United States installed ballistic missile defense systems in Eastern Europe, which the Russians considered a threat to their deterrence forces. Perhaps most importantly, this past decade, the United States has supported what was called color revolutions in the Mideast and in the Ukraine. And Putin, when he regained the presidency in 2012, believed that the United States was supporting a color revolution in Russia designed to overthrow his regime. And that's the reason, and he blamed Obama and he blamed Hillary Clinton on that, and that's the reason that such an enmity developed between the Obama administration and the Putin. When our new ambassador, Mike McFaul, arrived in Moscow to present his credentials at about that time, the headlines in the Moscow Times said, "American ambassador here to overthrow Russia." What a way to greet a new ambassador. So the bad relation today was stimulated in part by the actions of the United States and NATO. But it is also stimulated by aggressive actions taken by Putin to restore the glory and power of Russia as he saw it, and to publicly thumb his nose at the United States. Whatever his motives, the resulting actions, and you should understand this very carefully, his resulting actions have been very popular in Russia, and they're reflected in his very high approval ratings, approval ratings that any American president would kill to get. He annexed Crimea, he threatened eastern Ukraine, and thereby violating the so-called Budapest Agreement. He threatened neighbors in Europe with the Iskander missiles, which are based in Kaliningrad. And he indirectly threatened the United States when his head of media, Dmitry Kislov, publicly proclaimed, this was about a year and a half ago, Russia is the only country that can turn the United States into radioactive ash. That's the head of Russian media, no doubt speaking for President Putin. Of course, much of this bombast directed against the United States is rhetoric for domestic consumption. But it is not rhetoric that he had put rebuilding his Cold War nuclear arsenal as his highest security priority. And of course, we are following his lead. We have underway now, as we sit here and speak, a program to completely rebuild our nuclear arsenal, the latest estimate of which it will cost $1.25 trillion. And the taxpayers are hardly aware that this is happening. Have we forgotten the dangers of the Cold War nuclear arms race? Putin has also dropped Russia's long-standing no first-use policy. All during the Cold War, for all of our concern with Russia, they were publicly proclaiming they would never use nuclear weapons first. And Putin has explicitly withdrawn from that pledge and said instead nuclear weapons will be the weapon of choice if Russia feels threatened. So Vladimir Putin is playing a very aggressive game, but he's playing with a very weak hand, aside from his nuclear weapons. He has serious demographic problems, including a declining population. He has a serious problem in Russia with drunkenness. They're in a precarious economic posture. Economically, they are basically a petrostate. Their economy prospered when oil was at $100 a barrel, and it foundered when oil got down to $30, $40, or $50 a barrel. A significant part of their government funds come from oil profits. Social programs are important to ordinary Russians, depend on those programs. And so they're in a very serious economic problem today. To be sure, Putin blames their economic problems on American and NATO sanctions, which indeed are a small part of that, but the big part of his problem really has to do with the cost of oil. When oil was at $100 a barrel, he had an opportunity to use his excess profits to diversify his economy, but he did not do so. So there's a lot of trouble for Russia. But I want to emphasize that is not good news for the United States. Putin is diverting attention from this by playing his national card, which is annoying to the Americans, but it could be more than annoying. It could become real danger. I want to be clear, though, on one point. I'm confident that Putin does not want a military conflict with the United States or with NATO. But he is playing a very dangerous game in the Ukraine and the Baltics. And the danger then is not that he wants a conflict or that we want a conflict, but that we will blunder into some sort of a conflict. Russia, NATO, for example, in response to his threat to the Baltic nations, has deployed a brigade there. What if the Russian brigade and if the NATO brigade and Russian forces were really involved in some sort of a military conflict? Russia, of course, has geographic advantage, but the fundamental advantages are all with NATO: conventional military strength, the economy, technology. The question then is not whether Putin will see an advantage to some sort of military conflict. I'm sure he will not. But that we will blunder into a conflict. I think Putin understands that in any conflict, Russia would lose unless they escalate to tactical nuclear weapons. In other words, unless they do exactly what they say they would do. If they did that, no one, not Putin, not the American president, not any of the generals, can really control escalation. And I do not like that scenario. That's my bad news about Russia. Now let's move on to China. For more than 3 decades, China has had an unprecedented economic growth, more than 10% a year, year after year, for 30 years. And that's, as I said, is unique and quite remarkable. But I think there's trouble ahead. For the last 2 years, their growth has dropped to less than 7%. Now, most nations in the world would love to have a 7% growth, but it's not enough for China. They have more than 100 million Chinese who have been left behind by this economic growth, and who every night see the good life in eastern China on their TV sets. That causes a real political problem in China. Also, there's the question of whether their growth figure might have been fudged a little bit, so it's actually less than 7%. They also have minority problems in Western China. You don't read about them much, but there are lots of them going on. There are maybe 100 demonstrations each year against the authorities in China. And finally, and I'm sure you're all aware of this, they have a very bad pollution problem in China. Anybody that's visited Beijing or Shanghai, particularly in the wintertime, will understand just how serious the pollution problem. And that pollution problem is causing political problems. So the government needs a safety valve to deal with this unrest. And the time-proven safety valve for beleaguered governments is promoting ultra-nationalism. In the case of China, that amounts to promoting anti-Japanese and anti-American sentiments in China. That is leading to some military aggressiveness, especially in the South China Sea. There's been a major growth in China in these past years in military expenditures, with special emphasis on what we call a blue water navy, making the Navy more than coastal defense, having extend out into the oceans, and anti-ship missiles to deal with the American carrier forces off China. Their goal is to drive the United States Navy hundreds of miles from their coastline. Is the United States Navy willing to be driven hundreds of miles from the coastline? The answer is no. And so that's scenario number one for some sort of blundering into some sort of a military confrontation. Not a confrontation that the two presidents order, but a confrontation that takes place because of commanders on the ground, or in this case, on the sea. They also are building artificial islands in the South China Sea. Generally, the problem is China regards the South China Sea as sort of an inland lake, and the United States and the rest of the world regard the South China Sea as international waters. So the Chinese actions are continually being challenged by the U.S. Navy, and that's scenario number two for a confrontation. Well, having given you these bad news things about China, let me sum up China by saying, on balance, I think we will work out these problems without conflict, simply because the stakes are so high and both governments realize the stakes are so high. But I must say I still do not like the scenarios that I've spelled out to you. So with those two good news stories, I'll now switch to North Korea. During the 90s, I worked in and out of government trying to bring about a non-nuclear North Korea. Obviously, I failed. North Korea now has a nuclear arsenal, an outrageous rhetoric, threatening rhetoric to go along with it. I was in Pyongyang a number of years ago, and my first night there, I met with the North Korean president, who showed me my schedule for the next day. And I looked at it and said, I don't agree with this schedule. There are no military men on this schedule. I was the Secretary of Defense. I want to meet some of your top military people while I'm here. So the next morning, I go into the first meeting, and instead of my scheduled meeting, the door opened and in walks a North Korean general. And the first thing he said to me was, This meeting was not my idea. I was directed to meet with you. It's a good way to start off a meeting. I was directed to meet with you. I don't think we should even be talking about giving up our nuclear weapons. So I said to him logically enough, why do you think nuclear weapons are so important to you? He said, to protect us from aggression. I said, from whom? He pointed to you, from you. And this was years ago. It was the time when the United States warplanes were attacking Belgrade, dropped bombs on Belgrade during the Kosovo crisis. That's the background for this next statement. He said, if you drop bombs on our cities, that will be followed by nuclear weapons dropped on your cities. Pause, not excluding Palo Alto, my hometown. Oh, that got my attention. Of course, that was bluster then. But they now have an arsenal of medium-range missiles capable of targeting all of South Korea and Japan, and they're developing ICBMs which could threaten the United States. Presently, those missiles have conventional warheads, but they are, of course, developing and testing nuclear warheads. So the bluster of 10 years ago now must be taken somewhat seriously. So what to do? If you read the papers at all in the last couple months, you'll know that one of the options being bandied about is what's called a preemptive strike. When I was the Secretary of Defense in '94, and we had our first crisis I faced actually was a North Korean crisis, we considered a preemptive strike. I had a plan on my desk for blowing up the nuclear facility at a place called Yongbyon. It would have had minimum consequence, very few casualties, but it undoubtedly would lead to an attack by North Korea against South Korea and cause thousands of casualties in South Korea. And a possible, that was relatively certain. What was possible is it could escalate into a nuclear war. Any war, North Korea would certainly lose. But a nuclear war, there would be literally millions of casualties. Half of the population of South Korea, more than 20 million people, live in Seoul and its outskirts, which are about a 1-hour drive from the border. So South Korea would be devastated in any war. There's much talk in the United States about, oh, they are developing an ICBM that could strike the United States, but South Korea is our ally. We have to be thinking about what could happen there as well and not be so single-minded in our view. So I say a preemptive strike is a really bad idea. Diplomacy? Well, it has failed in the past, and therefore people dismiss it. But I think it failed because we didn't address the basic question. What do the North Koreans want? Diplomats, when they conduct these negotiations, are sometimes famous for having a golden tongue. They can say beautiful things in beautiful ways. But a good diplomat, his tongue is less important than his ears, as he listens to what the other side is saying, what they want. What they want, without any doubt, is regime survivability. This is an abhorrent regime. It's a Stalinist regime, the last Stalinist regime in the world. So we abhor it, but they sort of like it, and they want to keep it. And so number one goal in North Korea is to keep the regime in power. Any proposal we make to them that does not give them an opportunity to see that happening, they will reject. If they can achieve that objective, then they'll go to the secondary objectives, which are economic improvements. All of our proposals in the past have helped their economy, but have not addressed the basic question. My criticism of our diplomatic policy on North Korea is bipartisan. I think both Obama and Bush, over that 16-year period, badly failed in their diplomatic negotiations with North Korea. Basically, they believed that if they waited long enough, the regime would collapse. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened, not about to happen very soon. In the meantime, they're building nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, so we have to do something about it. In diplomacy, it takes carrots and sticks. The carrots we've had are economic primarily, but we've had no sticks really. The only stick we have is threatening to go to war with them, which is not a credible threat. But China has significant sticks. They're the primary supplier of food and fuel to North Korea, and if they cut that off, there would be disastrous consequences. For reasons which are perfectly persuading to China, they've not been willing to do that in the past. A path to solution, then, a path to solution for China and the United States to agree on a joint diplomatic program where China presents the sticks and we present the carrots. And to get that, we have to somehow assure China that we're not there to overthrow this regime, because the thing they do not want to happen is the government of North Korea to collapse and leave a failed state on their border. So there is a path forward on diplomacy, but it's a very difficult path, and it's not clear that we are in a mood to follow that path. With that, let me switch to Iran. It has, for many decades, had a robust nuclear program, nuclear in the sense that they're producing enriched uranium. Enriched uranium can be used either for running power reactors, or they can be used for making nuclear bombs. If you have the process that enriches them to a certain degree to make for a power reactor, if you keep on enriching, you can get enough the kind of uranium, so-called highly enriched uranium, which is suitable for bombs. So it's a technology that can go two different directions. We believed they were doing that to get to a nuclear bomb capability. 5 years ago, I went and, on my unofficial basis, met with the Iranian National Security Advisor, who told me they did not want nuclear bombs. This is only for commercial use. We had a long discussion, and I must say I simply did not believe him, because it did not consistent with the activities that we could see. But since then, two big changes have occurred. One of them is they have gotten a new president, Rouhani, by the way, who just recently won a re-election as president. And the second is not just the United States, but the world put serious sanctions on Iran. And the combination of having a president who wanted a moderate program and those serious sanctions led to an agreement called the Iran Nuclear Agreement, which we got a little over a year ago. I think it's the result of this new government plus very effective sanctions. The agreement they got was significantly better than the one I thought they could get, based on my discussions, both with the National Security Advisor and their foreign minister. But as you may observe if you read the newspapers at all, you'll hear there's a lot of passionate opposition in this country to the Iran agreement, including it was an issue in the last presidential debate. So there's major opposition to the Iran agreement. I will point out this major opposition is strange bedfellows. Here are the three principal groups that oppose the opposition. The 55% of the American Congress, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They're all opposed to it. The irony is that the opposition in Israel and the United States is because they fear that this agreement will allow Iran to get a nuclear bomb. Opposition in Iran, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, they fear it will prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. Of course, both of them cannot be right. But I wanted to point out to one of you, any of you who are still thinking about this issue, the fantasy, what I consider a fantasy, which is that the opposition to the agreement in the United States argues that we should withdraw from the deal, reinstate sanctions, and negotiate a better deal. Who can be against a better deal? Well, there is not even a remote possibility of maintaining sanctions if the United States withdraws. The sanctions were worldwide sanctions, not just U.S. U.S. sanctions are not enough. They were worldwide sanctions. That's why they were effective. If we withdraw from the deal, our allies are gone on the sanctions. and along with their sanctions. And without sanctions, Iran has no incentive to negotiate another deal. So we can withdraw and take the consequences of withdrawal. We will not, I repeat, get a better deal. And now I want to move to Pakistan. So far, I've given you a lot of bad news. My last case is Pakistan, and some of you may conclude I saved the worst for last. Pakistan has had 3 wars with India and lost all 3 of them, and so therefore they've reverted to irregular warfare. Both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, somewhere between 100 and 200 nuclear weapons each. In addition, Pakistan has powerful terror groups that have some affiliation with some elements of the government. Some years ago, a terror group from Pakistan, with some government officials connected with it, undertook a major terrorist assault on Mumbai. I'm sure all of you saw the pictures of that on television. India showed restraint, to the surprise of some people. I'm now about to show you a video, and the video is my imagination of what could happen if there's another Mumbai, if Pakistan mounts another large-scale terror attack on India. In this case, my thesis is India does not show restraint the second time. So I'm going to now show you what I call my South Asian nuclear nightmare. This is a 4-minute video which we designed to go on YouTube to educate people about what the issues are. It's simple-minded, a cartoon sort of a video, but the facts behind it, I believe, are quite valid. In November of 2008, terrorists based out of Pakistan attacked the Taj Mahal Hotel and other targets in Mumbai, India, killing 168 and wounding hundreds more. I vividly remember as the scenes of horror played out on television for 4 days in front of a stunned worldwide audience. Despite allegations of Pakistani military involvement in the attacks, the situation did not escalate into a military conflict that time. But what if something like that happens again? I cannot help but imagine a darker outcome. My name is William Perry, and what follows is my South Asia nuclear nightmare.
On the early morning of January 26th, members of a Pakistani militant group prepare for an attack on the Republic Day parade celebration in New Delhi. The attack claims over 300 lives, injuring countless others. All of the militants died during the attack, except one. Upon interrogation, he reveals the location of the group's hideout. The information is quickly passed to senior government officials, and the cold start response is initiated. It gives the Indian military authorization to launch a punitive raid against the militants and cross over the border from the Punjab into Pakistani territory. In anticipation of India's invasion, the Pakistani government orders the NASAR Mobile Short-Range Tactical Nuclear Weapon System to be deployed to the border. The UN convenes an emergency meeting and urges both sides to show restraint. Just before dawn, the Indian army quickly overwhelms the militant camp. However, most of the fighters have already fled deeper into Pakistan. As the Indians ponder their next course of action, the NASAR system is moved near the border, 10 miles north of Kasur. Knowing that Pakistani military doctrine authorizes the use of tactical nuclear weapons against any invading force, the move is perceived as an urgent threat by the Indian military. After tense consultations, the government authorizes an airstrike to disable the nuclear battery. Despite the use of conventional munitions in the airstrike, the intense bombardment causes one of the warheads to detonate. The nuclear explosion causes massive damage around the suburbs of Lahore, along with villages on both sides of the border. Military and civilian casualties are in the tens of thousands. Unable to identify the source of the nuclear explosions, Pakistan interprets them as a nuclear first strike from India. In response, the Pakistani military launches nuclear missiles at dozens of military and civilian targets in India. Minutes later, India orders a counterstrike. Seven major cities are completely destroyed. Casualties are in the tens of millions. Both governments collapse and the militaries take control. The radioactive fallout reaches as far as Australia. The radiation also saturates the Himalayas, contaminating fresh water for over a dozen countries, including China. The smoke and ash dispersed in the atmosphere lowers temperatures across all of Asia. Crop failures lead to food shortages around the globe, resulting in widespread starvation. Billions of lives are affected.
Let me summarize the nuclear dangers I've talked about this morning. A nuclear war by accident or miscalculation. That is, we might blunder into a nuclear war. Those dangers went away at the end of the Cold War, and they are now returning. A regional nuclear war. The danger did not exist during the Cold War. It is now very real, with India and Pakistan as a poster child of such a war, and North Korea following in the footsteps of Pakistan. And then, with another danger that did not exist during the Cold War, nuclear terrorism. It's now a very real danger, more dangerous than most people understand. In an attempt to foster an understanding of how catastrophic a nuclear terror attack could be, I created a scenario in the preface of the book I just released. I'm going to share this scenario with you, illustrated in stark cartoon fashion. We made another video, and this one based on a nuclear terror attack on Washington, D.C. Buried deep under these bone-dry high plains, in a covert section of a massively hardened centrifuge facility, a team is hard at work. They are members of a breakaway faction of the country's security forces, and they are busy enriching 40 kilograms of uranium. By July 3rd, they achieve their target of 90% enrichment, and then transfer the uranium to a nearby secret lab, where another team of technicians assembles it into a crude nuclear bomb. On August 31, they finish their work. They put the bomb in a packing crate labeled agricultural equipment and transport it to a nearby airfield where it is stored in a warehouse. 2 weeks later, it is removed and loaded onto an aircraft with civilian air cargo markings. It flies to Dubai, where the crate is transferred, along with other goods and equipment, to a global air transport freighter. Destination: Washington, D.C. The plane lands at Washington's Dulles International Airport at 2:47 a.m. on September the 15th. By late afternoon, the crate is delivered to a warehouse in the southeast part of the district. Then, before daybreak, on September the 17th, the bomb is removed from the crate and loaded onto a delivery truck. Several hours later, an American citizen eases the truck out into traffic. She drives it to a location on Pennsylvania Avenue, midway between the White House and the Capitol building. At 11:09 a.m., she stops in the middle of traffic, climbs down onto the street, and triggers the detonator. The bomb explodes with a power of 15 kilotons. There are more than 80,000 instant deaths, including the president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, and the 320 members of Congress present when the bomb goes off. There are also more than 100,000 seriously wounded, and virtually no place to treat them. Telecommunication facilities throughout the greater Washington area have gone down. Soon, cable news is broadcasting scenes of vast devastation from the Capitol. A short time later, all major news outlets report receiving an identical message. The message claims that 5 more bombs are hidden in 5 different cities across the country. It says one of these bombs will be set off each week for the next 5 weeks, unless all American troops based overseas are ordered to return immediately to the U.S. homeland. The nation is hurled into panic. Everything begins shutting down. Within a half hour, the stock market drops more than 70% before trading is halted. From coast to coast, masses of people begin to stream out of cities, no matter their size or location. There is widespread gridlock. Cell phone systems are soon overwhelmed, and calls cannot go through. Internet access is impossible in many regions, and the nation is now in a constitutional crisis. By succession, the Senate President pro tem is now the country's president. But he is being treated for pancreatic cancer far from the Capitol at the Mayo Clinic. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both of whom were testifying to the House Armed Services Committee on their recent budget request, are dead as well. Martial law is declared in Washington and surrounding regions, and the next day, the entire country. There is widespread looting and violence in many cities. Federal and National Guard troops are mustered. Soon there are reports of troops firing on crowds. There are increasing numbers of reports of crowds rioting against immigrants and foreigners. Within days, the military begins to construct large detention centers around the country. Much of my talk today, I'm afraid, has a doomsday ring to it. But that truly is not who I am. I'm basically an optimist. When I see a bad situation, I always look for a ray of hope. And my ray of hope is that I believe that we can still reverse the downward slide in the United States and Russian relations. And that is what I'm working for. If we could succeed in that, we could then work to stop and reverse the drift to an increasing dependence on nuclear weapons. But I realize that giving a lecture or writing a book is not going to get that message across to the millions of people it needs to get across to. I need to get the message across using the internet. And so I've set up a W.J. Perry Project website, which you can go to. I've put on YouTube those 2 videos that you've seen, and I'm preparing 2 more. And I've prepared several MOOCs. MOOCs is an ugly acronym for a massive open online course. The first course is already on the internet, and you can go and sign up for it tonight if you want to. It's free and no grades. You'll love it. I have already said that these weapons have the power to end our civilization, and I do not believe that is hyperbole. In my own small way, I'm trying to address the problem of educating the public. My books, my lectures, a set of online courses, and a set of online videos. I'm also devoting some of my time to Track 2 dialogue with Russian colleagues. 2 months from now, I'll be meeting with the Luxembourg Forum, a Russian-European-American dialogue focused on measures to lower the likelihood of nuclear war. Track 2 dialogues and educational programs may seem to you like a feeble response to problems that are so daunting. But the consequences of reliving the Cold War nuclear arms race are worse. The consequences of a nuclear war are so terrible that we must do everything we can, each of us, to prevent those outcomes. And so I've devoted the remainder of my career to this mission. I do this because I believe that time is not on our side, because having helped develop America's nuclear arsenal, I have special knowledge on how to dismantle it, and I feel some special responsibility to do so. And because I have 8 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, and I would like them to live in a world not faced with the existential tragedy of a nuclear holocaust. So why do I keep working at this intractable problem instead of spending my golden years in the Garden of Eden known as Palo Alto? And I answer that question with one of my favorite lines from Robert Frost. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Next week's lecture will be on government dysfunction. The speaker will be Steve Levitsky, professor of government at Harvard University. Please join us.